Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome back to the modding of Isaac with Lyte. Today, we're going to work with tier variants. We're going to change the way our tiers look in the game, and we're going to work on a couple of interactions that tiers can have with the things around them, particularly hitting the floor, hitting a grid entity, or hitting an enemy. So let's get started, take a look at how it's going to go. What we're going to do is switch over to a PolyOn, because we're going to have these tiers happen as a PolyOn instead of being connected with a collectible. So first off, we have, I'm not sure if you can really see very clearly, but we're firing tiny little pentagrams. And when they hit the ground, they turn into goo. When they hit a wall, they also turn into goo. And if we find ourselves an enemy, when they hit an enemy, they cause a fart. That's really all there is. They're incredibly overpowered for room clear. They're not necessarily amazing for killing bosses, but you can fill a room with this goo pretty darn quick, even without, you know, any sort of tiers up. We're taking needless damage because, well, I'm not paying too close attention, and I don't usually play on the keyboard. But as you can see, room clear, super easy. Hello. But when you get into the boss, it doesn't deal a whole lot of damage with the farts. So here we are with the Haunt. It really doesn't deal a whole lot of damage, but it does do the farting. It does leave the trails of creep. And all around, it's an alright tier effect. How about we keep it quiet this episode? Nice, calm, quiet music. So let's head over to the code, see how all this works. So when we're working with our fancy new mod, we're going to need content, resources, and main.lua. In content, we just have entities2.xml because tiers are in fact entities. In resources, we need the GFX for what they look like, and then we need the sprite sheet to make it work. So I actually use the pentagram effect that you get from black powder to make these tiers. You can use any size thing, it just makes it higher resolution if you use something too high of resolution. But if you want it to fit in thematically, you want to use a low res item such that it scales properly. Let's head into this nm2 file so you can see how those are generally set up. So in the upper right, you'll have sprite sheets. If when you open up your animation editor, you don't see these things on the side, it's because your resolution is too low. If you can't raise it any higher, there are various windows that you can unlock and move around and shift everything such that you can see all the parts you need. So if you only see over to about center view here, you're gonna have to move things around. This sprite sheet, you just load it on in. It's what we use to view our tier. Here we've got the body where we actually make our animations happen. So this is a nice spinning pentagram. It's only got 3 active frames. This first one starts at rotation 0. It's scaled down quite a lot because it's 256 by 256 in the original, but we only want it to be like 16 by 16, and this is percentage. So you scale the 256 down by like a factor of 16, and voila, there you go. We rename the animation idle such that we don't need to use any Lua to determine which animation it should use, because idle is the default when you're firing a tier. So here we are, the first frame, like we said, rotation 0. This one at frame 10 is rotation 180. Well, since we set it to be interpolated, it goes from rotation 0 to rotation 180 across all of these frames. And then we do the same thing here, but this final one is 360 minus 18, so 342. And then we interpolate again to get over here. And then when it's actually going through, it looks great. It just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. We have it set to loop, so it will continually do this animation over and over and over again. And if you hit play, you can see it in action. Again, if you need to add frames, you hit insert frame. If you want to make them longer, you change the duration. Interpolation gets you from point A to point B as smoothly as possible. Pivot changes where this green cross is such that it rotates around that central axis. Height and width is how big they are over in the sprite sheet. Crop X and crop Y are where the upper left corner is on your sprite sheet. And then scaling is what scaling is. We have no events here because nothing fancy happens. So that's enough with the Anim2 file. That's the animation editor. That's how you make things happen. You make the imagery, you bring it in here. If you need to squash it or rotate it, you can do that in the animation editor without adding to your artwork load. Whew. So that's the animation editor. That's all we really needed from that. We don't have a whole lot else outside of main.lua. So we'll check entities2.xml, but making a new tier variant is like making any other variant. You come in here, you set the anim2 path. So we take our anim2 file and put it in here. If you want a tier variant, you make it ID2, and then you set the variant. Again, we hard code all of these things for the entities because it's hard to know which things should be incremented. Should it be the ID? Should it be the variant? Should it be... Yeah, it's eventually probably going to be sorted out such that if you don't have an ID, it increments the ID and sets it as variant 0. If you have an ID, it just sets the next variant, and then if you set the variant, it'll set the subtype, but even that is going to be problematic. So for now, you set the ID, you set the variant, you just grab a large number that's random, go to random.org, they've got good random numbers there. And then all the rest of it is just find something similar to what you want. I took Death's Touch Scythes. Collision mass 8, radius 8. They're about the size of my pentagram. We could probably up the number of collision points because it's really round. But all in all, this tends to work out pretty well. For yours, just fiddle around with these numbers until it looks and acts the way you want it to. If we head over to main.lua, there's nothing too fancy in here, just a little bit of code for detecting when it hits the ground, when it hits a thing, and when it hits an enemy. And then for spawning the goo on the ground in the right color, and without a weird flash at the beginning. So we start off as always, register the mod, set up the game. We get an entity variant by name for our OmniGram. I was originally going to have it drop pentagrams on the floor, but the pentagram effect was being a little weird when I tried to summon it. So we just went with puddles of goo. Then we have OmniFart. We set some basic sorts of things regarding the fart. Because it has radiuses, it has scale, and there are different subtypes. So 0 is the basic poisonous fart, but 1 is that red contagious fart. Scale is how big it looks, radius is how wide it hits. We've got on update, will we come back? Well, this last bit. We've got on cache. If the player is a PolyOn, we take their falling speed and increase it. Keep in mind, falling speed is reversed from what one would expect. And so this cuts down on the range. If you've got full range, it's never going to hit the ground in a way that you're going to really like. So we make it more like number 1, where it just drops really fast. That's all this is doing. At the beginning of a run, and anytime you pick up any sort of range type item, it just comes in here, says tier falling speed, oof, make it fall faster. I do like working from the bottom up. I'm not sure why. This next bit is an on damage callback. So entity take damage, on damage. We don't have a filter because this is every enemy that takes damage we need to take a look at. So if any entity takes damage, you, them, anything, it comes in here and gives you an entity, which is the thing that took damage, amount, which is how much, flag, which tells you what type. Was it an explosion? Was it the IV bag? Who knows? The source of the damage, which is an entity reference, and the countdown. Now, even though source is an entity reference, it still has the type and the variant readily accessible to you. So what we do is we check whether or not the thing dealing the damage is of type tier and variant OmniGram. So was it our tier that caused it? If it was, then you fart at the entity that took damage, their position, of size radius that we set up top. I think this nil might be the source of the fart. I'm not entirely certain off the top of my head. And then the scale that we had from before and the subtype that we set up top as well. You change the subtype to 1, you get the contagious fart. I don't really like the contagious fart for this. Even still, this is kind of an overpowered item. So here we are. This is what you do if you want to see when your tier hits an enemy. So if your tier were piercing, like the Eye of Belial, here it would deal the damage and then it would keep going. So you could change the variant here from what it was before to the Eye of Belial type. Or if you wanted it to do a Jacob's Ladder effect, or if you wanted it to make explosions, anything, this is where you trigger it when it hits an enemy. Okay? But that's not the only time you might want to do things. So up here in update, this is a post P effect update, gives us the player. If our player is a PolyOn. So we're doing it by player type instead of by name. It seems better to do it by type than by name in cases like Lazarus, where dead Lazarus is the same as regular Lazarus name-wise, but you might want it to be differentiated between them. So if we're a PolyOn, we loop through all of the room entities. We do this a lot. It's the easiest way I know of to find the things you're looking for. Then you get the data from the entity, because we're going to work with custom data on tiers and on effects. So grab that, put it in data. If the entity type is tier, so that we find a tier in the air, we turn it into a tier, because tier objects have more properties than just entities. So we turn it into a tier. Then we check, is the variant not OmniGram? So is it Death's Touch? Is it regular? Is it blood? We want all of our tiers to be OmniGram tiers. This time, if you want to do it as a random chance, we already had a video on that. This time, we're just going to say if it's not, make it. If you try to turn everything into OmniGram without checking that it wasn't first, poof, it'll disappear. If you try to set the variant to the variant that it is, it'll disappear. So no good. So, and then we have else. Well, this else is if it's not OmniGram. So if it is OmniGram, we could have swapped this around. If it is do this stuff, else do the other. Whichever way you want to think about it. So if we are OmniGram, then we check, is the tier height greater than or equal to -5? Why -5, Lyte? Why? Well, it never quite gets down to 0. When it gets within a certain range, poofs out of existence, and -5 seems to be a good range for it to consistently see that it is hitting the floor. It gets down to, well, up to -4 point stuff. It actually starts around -20, and again, remember, negative is up in the Y direction. I'm not sure why it really considers that for Z type things with height, but it is. It's just the way it is. It starts in the -20s, ends around -4 point stuff. So when the tier height is greater than or equal to -5, you've crossed that threshold from -5 into -4, and it's consistently on the ground. Or your tier collides with grid. So this is, it hits a rock, it hits a poop, it hits the wall, anything that is a grid entity, it collides with that. That's when we make a puddle. And this particular thing, this tier, hasn't already done it. There are times where there might be multiple frames where it's on the ground. We only want to do this once. So we check, is it on the ground or colliding with the grid, and we haven't triggered it before, then we do something. What do? Well, we spawn our LemonMissout creep, because that was LemonMissout that you saw. But if you try to spawn it directly without any modifications, A, it's too powerful, and B, it gets a weird one frame before it does the loop. So we're going to do some things to prevent that. But when we summon it, we turn it into an effect, because otherwise it would just be an entity, and we shove it into data.gram. It was originally going to be a pentagram, but now it's an omnigram. It's got as many points as there are possible points. If you think about that, pentagram has 5, you add 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, you put in too many, it just becomes a blob, just like LemonMissout. Shove that in data.gram, such that if we come back here, we'll see we already have one. Then I decided, why not make it scale with your damage? So we take Graham's collision damage and set it to be player.damage over and then some constant. This is half of your normal damage, like half of your starting damage. So basically when you start off, it's going to do 2 damage per tick, I guess. Each time it deals damage, it'll do 2 instead of 3.5 or 0 or whatever LemonMissout's normal damage is. It'll scale with the player, starting at 2 and growing linearly with them. We set the color. Now, I added these just because it is going to be that tint eventually. It's partially red, a little bit green, which makes it slightly yellowed. No blue. And then this one's the really important one. This 4th digit is the transparency. We set it to be transparent when we summon it. And then we tell the game that that particular LemonMissout is ours. So we take our data, which is user data, .gram, which is something we defined, got data from that, because it's an entity too, and set OmniGram for that. So user data with user data. It can happen. And we set it to true such that when you use a LemonMissout pill, it doesn't look like our weird PolyOn creep. So we've got an invisible damaging creep that is customized. But it's only invisible for 1 frame. The first frame of its existence, it is invisible. The second frame, we find it when we go through this loop. And we go and look at, oh, okay, so entity type effect, and OmniGram is nil. Well, this probably isn't quite enough either. Because then it'll just turn all of our things red. So we go, and entity variant is LemonMissout. Oh, wait. Why could we do this? Because we're only ever going to set OmniGram on LemonMissout. So you can add extra things. You could leave that variant in there to be more certain. But all we really need is, heck, all we need to check is whether or not data.omnigram is not nil. Because the only thing we're going to set it on is our particular creep. So it's not wrong to leave the effect. It's not wrong to include the variant. It's not wrong to leave them out. They all do, in fact, work. They might do a tiny bit of extra processing, but it's often better to be safe than sorry. So leaving all of that in is perfectly reasonable. Because if we get something and it's not an effect, it will stop checking right then. It's not going to evaluate this, and then this, and then this. It's not going to evaluate all 3 if the first one's false. If the first one's false, it's done. It doesn't even check these. If the first one's good, then it checks the second one. If that's bad, it doesn't check the third. So I've seen people that have chains upon chains of ifs. If this, then, if this, then, if this, then. Days long. Which is really just if this, and that, and the next thing, and the other. And it doesn't save you anything, because the ands short circuit. They do the first. If it's false, you don't check the rest. So if all of this is true, which basically hinges on is data.omnigram not nil, then we set the color to be the appropriate color with an alpha of 1, so it is no longer transparent. So that makes sure that the first frame doesn't have that weird splash, but then it looks normal when it comes into existence. Whew, so many things. So that's how you make tier variants, how you make them look different. However, you'll notice I didn't talk about homing, piercing, or spectral in this episode because those are not tier variants. Those are tier flags. There's a good list available on the Modding of Isaac subreddit that goes through the vast majority of tier flags and lets you set any combination of those using just bitwise logic, I guess, ors and ands and whatnot. Lets you set exactly what you need, homing, piercing, and spectral, and things of that sort wise. Well, that's all I've got for this episode. I will see you in the next episode of the Modding of Isaac with Lyte.